The mansion was quiet, but not empty. The silence had a weight to it, like it was holding its breath. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, slicing through the air in gold beams that hit the polished floors and made the dust dance slowly, lazily, as if it had nowhere to rush. Every tick of the grand hallway clock echoed louder than usual, the kind of sound that makes your own heartbeat seem too loud. Adrian Blackwood pushed open the front door, back from a trip he hadn't planned. To cut short, his steps were deliberate, his expensive shoes clicking on marble, but even that sound was swallowed by the stillness. His mind carried numbers, deals, deadlines, the weight of everything he had built but nothing prepared him for what he would find in his kitchen. He stopped in his tracks, frozen. The air itself seemed to hush, and there she was, Mia, who had been a quiet shadow in this mansion for years, a figure he barely registered outside of chores and polite greetings. She was perched on the worn stool by the counter, her fingers wrapped around a phone, her lips moving softly. And then, he heard it. Words so simple, yet so impossible to ignore. "I need a boyfriend," she said, her voice a whisper, trembling under laughter that tried to hide a deeper sadness. It hit him like a punch he hadn't seen coming. Not a financial loss, not a betrayal in the boardroom, but something sharper, something human. Adrian's chest tightened. Mia, his maid, his invisible shadow, had a life he had never imagined, a life full of longing. And now, just for a moment, she had let a glimpse of it slip out. Her eyes, when he noticed them, were soft but serious, vulnerable, yet proud. There was a tremble in her fingers, a hush in her breath, a yearning that seemed to echo off the walls of the marble-floored kitchen. Adrian leaned against the doorway, still, silent. He didn't move closer. He didn't announce his presence. He wanted to stay invisible too, to watch, to listen. She didn't notice him, not at all. And in that, the power dynamic he had built over years, his wealth, his authority, his unspoken rules, was exposed as fragile. His gaze traced the curve of her shoulders, the way her hair fell softly across her cheek, the tension in her body, even as she laughed quietly into her phone. She was more than her uniform, more than the chores she did every day. And he felt something that unsettled him deeply. Recognition, years of oversight, ignorance, and casual dismissal pressed against him. How many times had he walked past her, in the hall, without a thought, assuming her silence meant contentment? How often had he overlooked her, small, quiet acts of girth, the way she remembered how he liked his coffee, how she straightened his papers without complaint, how she managed the chaos of the house with an unseen precision. And now, just like that, a simple sentence shattered all his assumptions. She had wants, needs, desires that had nothing to do with Hammond, everything to do with being human. He felt his stomach twist. Guilt. Maybe curiosity? Definitely. Something else, too. A tug he couldn't name. A tension in his chest that demanded attention. And yet, he didn't move. He just leaned there, letting the moment stretch, letting it burn into him. He watched as she spoke softly into the phone, a laugh escaping her lips that carried both joy and sorrow. A sigh followed, long and quiet, and it pressed against the walls like a secret. Adrian realized he had never truly listened to her voice. Not really, not once. He had seen her work, her presence, her silence, but he had never considered what she might feel. What she might want, what she might dream. The thought was startling. A man of his wealth, of his influence, of his control, suddenly powerless before a whispered confession. And yet, the feeling wasn't fear. It was awareness. The kind that makes a person stop and reconsider everything. Her words lingered in the air, even as she put the phone down. "I need a boyfriend." Simple, honest, unprotected. And in those 3 words, Adrian felt the heavy weight of everything he had ignored. The unspoken boundaries of class, of wealth, of social expectation, all shattered silently before his eyes. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything but the words lodged in his throat. What could he possibly say? How could he acknowledge her humanity without shattering the fragile order of their world? He watched her rise from the stool, moving to the sink with grace he had never appreciated. Her movements were small, precise, efficient, but somehow, now, they were also personal. Every step carried a subtle dignity, a quiet rebellion against the life she was expected to live. And Adrian felt it, felt the tremor of unfairness, the weight of his own privilege pressing against the reality of hers. For the first time, he saw the mansion not as a symbol of his achievement, but as a cage. A gilded cage for her, a place that demanded invisibility while offering no voice. He stepped forward almost unconsciously, stopping short of her shoulder. She didn't look up. She hummed softly, almost to herself, a tune of resilience and longing. And he realized, suddenly, that he was intruding into a private world, a world he had no right to enter but that he could not turn away from. His mind raced, spinning through scenarios, possibilities, consequences. And yet, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that moment, that whisper, that undeniable truth. She had a life beyond this house. She had desires. She had a heart that beat for more than servitude. Time slowed. The mansion seemed to breathe with him, with her, with the tension suspended between them. The dust motes danced in the sunlight like tiny witnesses. Adrian's reflection in the polished counters stared back at him, a man who had everything, and yet had never truly seen anything. And the realization cut deep. All the meetings, the deals, the money, the power, none of it compared to the awareness of another human being's heart. Her laughter, the soft sigh, the casual tone of her words, they haunted him. He felt a stirring deep in his chest, a mixture of shame and admiration, guilt and desire. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to respond, didn't even know if he should. But one thing was clear. He could not unhear her, could not unsee the life she carried behind her quiet eyes. And in that, something inside him shifted. The walls he had built, the roles he had assigned, the hierarchies he had enforced, they began to crumble in silence. And then she spoke again, not realizing he was there. I just want someone to see me, she whispered, almost too soft to hear. Adrian's heart clenched. He wanted to tell her, to offer something, anything. But he stayed silent, leaning against the doorway, letting her words fill the space. And for the first time in years, he felt truly awake. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy like humid air before a storm. Adrian knew he couldn't turn away, couldn't pretend he hadn't heard. And yet, he also knew that stepping into this moment carried a risk of embarrassment, risk of breaking the invisible rules, risk of confronting truths about himself he hadn't faced in decades. But he could feel it. A spark, small and trembling, that demanded action. It whispered to him louder than any business deal, any contract, any accolade. Notice her. See her. Respect her. He stayed there, frozen and conflicted, as the minutes ticked by, as the sunbeam shifted across the floor, as Mia continued her quiet routines. And in that stillness, Adrian Blackwood realized that the world he had built, the power he had wielded, the life he had thought completed, was incomplete. Not because he lacked wealth or status, but because he had never truly honored the humanity in front of him. Not because he had failed himself, but because he had failed to see her. And in that moment, with a whispered confession still hanging in the air, Adrian made a choice he didn't yet fully understand. A choice that would change everything. The mansion remained silent. The clock continued, its slow tick. Dust motes floated in the golden beams of sunlight. And Adrian, leaning in the doorway, understood one thing with crystal clarity. He could no longer look away. Mia moved through the mansion like a ghost. She was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, an unseen shadow gliding across polished floors, carrying silver trays and dusting grand chandeliers, her hands always in motion, her head bent low, her smile quiet and measured. She knew exactly how to be invisible. The staff barely noticed her presence. The family treated her with polite indifference. And Adrian, he saw her sometimes, but only in fragments. The way someone might notice a painting in the corner of a room, acknowledged, but distant. Unexamined, yet inside her chest, behind the stoic posture and disciplined movements, a storm raged. Why can't I have someone? She whispered to herself one afternoon as she polished the grand chandelier, her rag tracing gold and crystal, light catching her hair and throwing it into soft shadows on her face. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the cavernous kitchen. But it carried the weight of longing, of a life imagined and denied. She pictured it in small, stolen fragments, walking hand in hand down a quiet street, laughing without fear. A partner who looked at her as more than a uniform, more than a shadow. But when she raised her gaze to the mirrors lining the walls, she saw only a woman framed by walls she had never built, and privileges she would never claim. Adrian watched. From the doorway, the corner of his eye, catching her movements without her knowing he was there. He had returned from meetings, dinners, negotiations, deals, and yet none of it compared to the gravity of watching her now. For the first time, he saw clearly what power really meant. Not the power to buy, to command, to control, but the powerlessness of someone whose life was governed by invisible rules, by social expectations, by the weight of wealth that wasn't theirs. Here was a woman who longed for simple things, denied not by cruelty but by circumstance, by the quiet oppression of being unseen. He noticed the way her smile faltered when his sister's friends made a joke about her accent. A cruel little jab wrapped in laughter. Mia's lips twitched, forcing a polite curve that barely hid the sting. Her hands didn't shake, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the sharp inhale she tried to swallow. He noticed her patience when his mother scolded her for a minor imperfection, a misaligned silver fork or a slightly wrinkled napkin. Every word, every glance, Every gesture was a reminder that she was less than the family she served, and that her life existed in the margins of their world. One evening, Adrian found himself lingering near the servants' quarters. He wasn't supposed to be there, but curiosity and something deeper, something gnawing in his chest, pulled him closer. And then he heard her. Quiet sobs, small and trembling, a human sound he hadn't allowed himself to hear before. "I'm just tired of being invisible," she whispered, the words almost lost in the hush of the hallway. The sound pierced him, a sharp, sudden understanding that cut through the luxury and comfort surrounding him. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't dramatic. She was stating a truth he had ignored for years, a reality that reflected the failures of his own life, of the society he embodied. Adrian's chest tightened. He wanted to step forward, to wrap her in a comfort he had never given anyone, to erase the years of neglect and invisibility with a word, a gesture, a touch. But the weight of expectation pressed down on him, the unspoken rules of class, power, and propriety. Could he act on the impulse rising in him, without shattering the fragile equilibrium that governed their interactions? Could he reach out, without being judged, without ruining the carefully constructed social order that dictated their lives? He stood frozen, a silent witness to her grief. And as he watched, he realized that the conflict wasn't just hers, it was his, too. The world he had built, the wealth, the status, the meticulously curated image of success. It all demanded distance from people like Mia. It demanded that he not see her fully, that he not recognize her desires, her pain, her humanity. Yet here, she was undeniable, insisting on existence in a way that made him uncomfortable, made him question everything he had taken for granted. Days turned into weeks, and the invisible chains that bound Mia became harder to ignore. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but the effort it took to move through a world that didn't acknowledge her was exhausting. She endured jokes, scorn, and dismissal with a grace that made Adrian ache. Every forced laugh, every polite nod, every careful movement was a reminder of the injustice she faced. And every day, Adrian felt the growing tension inside him, a shift in his perception of himself, of her, of the mansion, of everything he had thought defined power. He began to notice small things, details that had always been there but invisible to him. The way her eyes lit up briefly when she thought no one was watching. The way she hummed softly to herself while washing dishes, a tune that seemed to carry hope and sorrow together. The way she paused, hand on the counter, lost in thought, as if the world outside the mansion existed only in her imagination. Adrian could no longer dismiss her. He could no longer pretend the inequality and invisibility were normal. One afternoon, as he passed the grand staircase, he overheard her talking to a fellow maid, her voice low but firm. "I just want to be seen. Not as a maid, not as a shadow. Just seen," she said. The words lingered, heavy and raw. Adrian felt them in his chest. He saw the quiet bravery it took to speak that sentence, the defiance in admitting desire in a world that demanded silence. He realized that dignity didn't always come with recognition, that resilience wasn't always rewarded, and that justice often required someone to risk disruption to correct imbalance. The tension in Adrian built like a storm, gathering beyond. The Hillsy couldn't retreat anymore. Every time he saw her laugh at a cruel joke, every time he witnessed her enduring criticism, every time he heard the faint tremor in her voice, he felt the injustice as though it were happening to him, as though her pain had become his own. And he began to question his own morality, his own choices, his own life. Could he continue to stand by, to watch, to benefit from a system that denied her humanity? Or was it time to act, even if it meant challenging everything he had built, everything he had believed, everything he thought he knew about power? Conflict escalated within him. Adrian realized that acknowledging Mia's struggle wasn't just a matter of empathy, was a confrontation with his own complacency. His wealth, his privilege, his carefully constructed life had insulated him from reality, blinded him to the quiet suffering of those who served him, and left him unprepared for the complexity of human longing and resilience. Yet he couldn't deny the stirring that had begun in his chest. The pull toward justice, toward recognition, toward something that felt like redemption. And then, one evening, as he lingered just outside the servants' quarters again, he caught sight of her through the narrow doorway. She was sitting quietly, folding linen, her face calm but her eyes distant. The weight of invisibility pressed on her like a heavy cloak, and Adrian realized that her strength's the very thing that had always kept her afloat was also a testament to the cruelty of the system she navigated every day. Her patience, her grace, her quiet endurance demanded acknowledgement. She deserved more than polite gestures, more than fleeting attention. She deserved recognition. She deserved to be seen. The mansion felt suddenly smaller, more confining. The corridors, the chandeliers, the polished floors. They were no longer just symbols of wealth. They were markers of constraint, of separation, of the invisible rules that governed the lives of people like Mia, and Adrian felt the oppressive weight of it all. He had lived surrounded by these rules his entire life, enforcing them without question, benefiting from them without awareness. Now, confronted with her reality, he felt the stirrings of change, an internal struggle he could no longer ignore. Mia rose from the stool, moving with deliberate grace, her movements quiet but precise, her mind elsewhere. Adrian watched her, caught between admiration and guilt, desire and propriety. He realized that the moment he had been avoiding acting on recognition, on empathy, on the awareness of her humanity was now inevitable. He could no longer stand at the threshold. Silent, passive, the invisible chains that bound her demanded confrontation. They demanded choice. They demanded courage. And as he lingered in the shadows, Adrian felt the first cracks in the armor of his own life. He understood that power wasn't about dominance, money, or control. It was about recognition, justice, and moral courage. He knew that if he wanted to honor her, to act rightly, he would have to confront everything he had been taught about his place in the world, everything he had built his identity on. The weight was enormous, but so was the responsibility. Conflict had mounted. Injustice had been witnessed. And now, Adrian Blackwood faced a choice. Stay silent, maintain the illusion of control, and let the world continue as it was. Or act. Step forward, acknowledge Mia, and risk everything he thought he knew about power, status, and propriety. The tension hung in the air, thick, palpable, almost visible. Dust motes floated in the late afternoon sunlight like tiny witnesses, and somewhere in that quiet, still space, a moral imperative whispered louder than any meeting, louder than any deal, louder than wealth itself. See her? Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the silent corridor. His chest was tight, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He could feel the shift within him, the internal struggle that neither wealth nor reputation could resolve. He knew the invisible chains were not only around Mia, they were around him, too, binding him to indifference and detachment. And he knew, with a certainty that startled him, that he could not unsee, could not unknow, could not ignore. Something had changed. The world he thought he controlled had shown him its limits. And the human before him, the one he had long overlooked, had revealed the truth he could no longer deny. The night sparkled like 1,000 diamonds reflected in crystal glasses. The chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Blackwood mansion threw sharp light across polished marble, cutting the shadows into geometric shapes. Music flowed softly, a gentle rhythm that carried laughter and the clinking of fine silverware. Guests in gowns and tuxedos glided across the floor. Their conversations a mix of praise, gossip, and subtle displays of status. Everything was precise, perfect, polished, the kind of night designed to showcase wealth, influence, and control. And Mia was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She moved through the room like a quiet force, unseen, her hands adjusting napkins, straightening chairs, making sure every detail sparkled. She worked tirelessly, invisible to the world, carrying the weight of the evening with a practiced smile. She was exhausted, but she moved with dignity. Her uniform, perfectly pressed, hid the trembling of her hands beneath the starch and neat lines. Her lips curved into polite smiles whenever a guest passed, her eyes dropping just enough to avoid notice. She had done this 1,000 times before, and she would do it 1,000 times more. But inside her chest, a storm simmered, a mixture of fatigue, longing, and a quiet, unacknowledged pride. She had grown accustomed to invisibility. She had learned to survive in it. And yet, tonight, there was a sense of anticipation she could not place, a tension that made her pulse quicken even as she worked in silence. Adrian Blackwood watched from the doorway, a silent observer of the world he had created. He had always considered himself a man of control, a master of appearances. Wealth, influence, reputation, they were his instruments, and he had wielded them carefully for decades. But as he watched Mia move through the room, adjusting details, and guiding staff with quiet precision, he felt a strange tension coil in his chest. It was not anger or frustration, not the satisfaction of dominance he usually felt in these settings. It was awareness, recognition, he realized, as he had in private moments before, that her life, her value, had nothing to do with him or with anyone in this room. And yet, until now, no one had acknowledged it. The moment came suddenly, like lightning striking without warning. One of the guests, a man with a polished smile and a cruel streak, let slip a comment loud enough for Adrian to hear. "Careful, Mia might get ideas. Don't let her talk too much, or she might forget she's just here to serve." Laughter rippled around him, sharp, shallow, cruel, A few people joined in, their whispers cutting into the air like knives, their amusement masking something deeper. The satisfaction of watching someone like Mia remain small, contained, polite. Invisible, Adrian's chest tightened, his jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him, leave it, be maintained decorum, don't disrupt the night, but another part, stronger than propriety or fear, demanded action. He could feel the tension rising like a tide ready to break, threatening to spill over into the rigid, ordered world he had built. The room held its breath for him, though no one knew it yet. All eyes, all expectations, all unspoken rules, they would soon meet their reckoning. He stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, silent yet commanding. The room seemed to pause, the music dipping in his awareness, the chatter fading as his movement drew attention. He stopped beside Mia, who didn't notice him at first, focused on her tasks, her back straight, her hand steady. Then, she looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened, not recognition at first, but the sudden, sharp awareness that something was about to shift. Without a word, Adrian extended his arm. The gesture was simple, calm, decisive. Would you like to dance? His voice was low but carried over the subtle murmur of the guests. Shock rippled across the room like a stone thrown into still water. Whispers started to circle, soft but insistent, rising with tension. Guests froze mid-step. Forks paused halfway. Two mouths, eyes darting between the two figures who now commanded the ballroom without intending to. Mia's hands faltered for a heartbeat, disbelief freezing her movements. She froze completely. Her breath caught. Her heart raced, thrumming like a drumbeat in her chest. Fear and hope collided in her eyes, battling for dominance. She had never been offered this, not in money, not in status, not in life. Never. The underdog, invisible for years, had suddenly become the center of attention. Not because she had sought it, not because she had demanded it, but because Adrian had chosen to see her worth. Every whispered insult, every joke at her expense. Every moment she had endured faded in comparison to this one decisive act. Adrian held her gaze, steady, unflinching. He saw everything, the tension, the exhaustion, the longing, and he made the choice that no one else would make for her. By offering his arm, by acknowledging her presence as equal in that moment, he shifted the power in ways that money, reputation, and social convention could never achieve. The room around them seemed to shrink, the crystal chandeliers and marble floors fading into insignificance as the focus tightened on the unexpected connection between the millionaire and the maid. Mia's hand hovered for a heartbeat before resting lightly in his. The touch was small, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement, of recognition, of humanity finally seen. Adrian led her to the floor, and the music adjusted as if recognizing the gravity of the moment. Their first step was careful, measured, hesitant, but with every movement, the balance of power transformed. The people who had mocked her fell silent, their whispers dying as they watched the billionaire treat the maid with respect, admiration, and a calm authority that belonged to no one else in the room. Her heart raced not with fear, not with obligation, but with validation, with recognition, with the affirmation that her life, her dignity, and her existence mattered. And in that moment, Adrian realized something as well. His decision had freed him too. He was no longer bound by shallow trappings of status, expectation, or the unspoken rules of society that had defined him for decades. In seeing her, in honoring her, he had stepped out of the cage of his own creation. He was human again, real again, vulnerable, and yet empowered in a way money had never allowed. The dance was more than movement. It was poetry in motion. A silent statement, a reversal of every assumption the guests had ever made. Mia's back straightened, her head held high, her smile real and warm. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer small. She was recognized, respected, honored, and the room could not ignore it. Eyes followed, whispers faded, and the weight of judgment turned inward. Those who had mocked, heard had nothing to say. Those who had sneered now understood that recognition and dignity could not be bought. Forced or faked, they had to be chosen. Adrian felt it too, the shift in the energy of the house. The mansion, once a cage of roles and labels, now held a new power, a new life. It was no longer just a place of wealth and hierarchy. It was a place where choice mattered, where acknowledgement could dismantle invisible walls, where humanity could be recognized in its purest form. And for the first time, he understood that his wealth and influence were not true measures of power. True power lay in moral courage, in seeing what others overlook, in giving dignity where it is due. The dance continued, simple, steady, but it carried the weight of transformation. Mia's eyes shone with unshed tears. Her chest lifted with newfound confidence, and her laughter, soft and genuine, punctuated the air like a promise. Adrian matched her steps, not with pride or arrogance, but with respect, patience, and the calm authority of a man who had finally learned what it meant to act rightly. Around them, the ballroom existed only in fragmentsy laughter of the wealthy. The clinking glasses, the polished floors, everything secondary to the human connection unfolding at its center. And yet, even in this moment of triumph, tension lingered. Guests exchanged furtive glances, some impressed, some scandalized, some uncertain how to react. The reversal was quiet, subtle, but undeniable. Power had shifted, even if only briefly. Rules had been broken, expectations had been rewritten. And Adrian knew, deep in his chest, that this was only the beginning. Change had begun in this room, and it would not stop with a single dance. By the time the music slowed, the moment had burned itself into the consciousness of everyone present. Mia stepped back, heart racing, but smiling, a real, unguarded smile. Adrian released her hand, but held her gaze, and in that look was understanding, acknowledgement, and respect. No words were necessary. They had spoken in a language that transcended wealth, status, and societal expectation. The language of human dignity. The night continued around them, but nothing was the same. Mia's place in the world, in that mansion, in Adrian's life, had shifted irreversibly, and Adrian understood that he had been changed too. The house was no longer a cage, it was a place where choice, recognition, and moral courage had power. And in this single, unthinkable act, both of them had been liberated.
The moral was clear, even in the silence that followed. Recognition costs nothing, but it changes everything. True power is not measured in wealth, influence, or status. It is measured in courage, in humanity, and in the willingness to honor another person's dignity, even when society expects you not to. And as Adrian watched Mia return to her duties, her back straight, her head high, he knew this was only the beginning. He had made the unthinkable choice, and in doing so, he had discovered the profound truth. To see someone fully is to be transformed yourself. Weeks passed quietly, but in the silence, life shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. The mansion felt different now, though the chandeliers gleamed just as brightly, the floors shone the same, and the walls remained tall and imposing. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a breath of wind stirring curtains in an empty hallway. Mia moved through the rooms with a new lightness, a confidence that hadn't been there before. She no longer whispered her desires into the empty corners of the kitchen or the servants' quarters. She spoke openly, laughed freely, and walked with her head held high. Even the way she carried herself, a small, deliberate tilt of her chin, the steady rhythm of her steps, spoke volumes. She had claimed space in a world that had never invited her to occupy it. Adrian watched quietly, from the doorway, from the hall, from wherever he could find a vantage point that allowed him to admire without intruding. He saw the subtle ways she transformed herself, and through her, he too felt a transformation stirring within him. The mansion, once a theater of power and status, had become a stage for humanity. Every interaction now carried weight, not because of hierarchy, but because of choice. Adrian understood, finally, that true power was never in money, never in titles, never in the ability to command others. It was in empathy, in courage, and in the willingness to honor another human being. He felt the pull of something he had long neglected, a force that neither wealth nor influence could ever provide: connection. His friends, those accustomed to whispering judgments behind crystal glasses and polished smiles, still gossiped about the events of the gala, about the sight of the millionaire offering his arm to the maid. But Adrian barely noticed. The chatter felt small, shallow, meaningless. What mattered was no longer the reflection of his status in the eyes of others. It was the quiet knowledge that he had seen, truly seen, someone who had spent her life being invisible. The laughter of society, the applause of peers, the weight of their approval, they could not compare to the clarity he now felt in his chest, the recognition of dignity where it had always deserved to be acknowledged. Mia, too, had learned lessons she had never expected. Vulnerability, once a source of fear, had become a source of strength. She realized that opening herself, showing desire, acknowledging longing, was not weakness, it was bravery. Even the most unlikely circumstances, even a life measured in the margins of wealth and status, could yield respect, recognition, and yes, even love. The world had shifted beneath her feet, subtly but undeniably, because someone chose to honor her humanity, and in doing so, she had begun to honor herself. Together, they navigated a new balance, delicate and unspoken. Adrian no longer saw her as a shadow, a servant, a reflection of convenience. Mia no longer approached him with caution, with measured politeness, with the invisible chains of expectation. They existed in a shared space now, a place of dignity, mutual recognition, and unspoken understanding. Every glance, every pause, every small smile carried the weight of their new reality. There was laughter, yes, and there was still work to be done, but it was different now. There was respect embedded in every interaction, a quiet acknowledgement that neither power nor wealth dictated worth. Even the mansion seemed to respond. Rooms that had once felt cold and unyielding now held warmth in subtle ways. Sunlight poured differently through the windows, falling across floors where dust once danced in solitude. The kitchens, the hallways, the grand dining rooms, they became shared spaces, arenas not of hierarchy but of presence. It was not that wealth had diminished, it had not. But the lens through which it had been viewed had changed, and everything shifted with that simple awareness. Adrian found himself learning lessons he had long forgotten. Comfort, he realized, could be bought with money. Respect, admiration, influence, they could be accumulated, displayed, and maintained. But understanding, connection, true recognition of another human being, these could not be purchased. They demanded courage. They demanded action. They demanded moral clarity that, until now, he had ignored. He understood that the moment he had chosen to act, to offer his arm, to see her fully, had rippled through both their lives in ways he could not have anticipated. Mia, carrying herself with newfound pride, laughed in ways that were spontaneous, full, unforced. She shared stories, small and intimate, in spaces that had once required silence. She moved with freedom, aware that her worth was no longer contingent on others' approval, that her desires, her needs, her very presence mattered. And Adrian, observing quietly, felt a release he had not known he needed. He had been trapped, too, in the invisible chains of expectation, in the cage of status and perception. Seeing her, recognizing her, honoring her, that had broken his own shackles. Days turned into weeks and the transformation solidified. Guests arrived, greeted, and left, carrying their judgments, their whispers, and their preconceptions. None of it touched Adrian and Mia. They had built a sanctuary within the walls of the mansion, a quiet space where dignity, respect, and shared humanity reigned. It was not dramatic. It was not flashy. It was subtle, like light filtering through curtains at dawn. Yet it was profound, and its effects were irreversible. One afternoon, as the sun poured across the marble floors and the chandeliers caught the light, Mia paused mid-step to look out a window. Adrian was nearby, polishing a set of silver candlesticks, though he no longer worried about the minutiae of appearances. He simply observed her. And in that simple act of watching, without judgment, without expectation, he felt a deep understanding settle over him. Life's greatest value, he realized, did not lie in dominance, in control, in accumulation of wealth. It lay in seeing the unseen, honoring the uncelebrated, recognizing the overlooked. It lay in acts of moral courage, in the quiet acknowledgement of another person's dignity. Mia turned, catching his gaze. For a moment the world outside ceased to exist. No wealth, no gossip, no hierarchy, nothing mattered except the mutual recognition reflected in each other's eyes. A soft smile passed between them, small but loaded with meaning. They had both changed. They had both grown. And in that silent acknowledgement, the lesson was complete. Dignity, humanity, and recognition could transform lives more than money ever could. Adrian understood the depth of his own growth. Wealth had given him comfort, influence had given him control, but neither had taught him the value of choice. The choice to act rightly, the choice to see, the choice to honor someone's humanity. And Mia's quiet longing, once dismissed as trivial or unimportant, had sparked this transformation. Her courage to hope, her resilience to endure invisibility, had ignited a moral clarity in him that no boardroom, no gala, no trophy could ever provide. The mansion, once a theater of hierarchy, had become a place of liberation. Not for wealth, not for status, not for appearances, but for recognition, respect, and humanity. Mia walked taller, smiled brighter, laughed more freely. Adrian moved with a quiet confidence, no longer weighed down by appearances, expectations, or social judgment. And together they navigated a delicate, new balance, a shared life measured not in gold, marble, or crystal, but in dignity, choice, and shared humanity. The moral crystallized in Adrian's mind like sunlight on water. Wealth can buy comfort, influence can command obedience, but understanding cannot be purchased. Compassion, courage, and the choice to act, these are the true measures of a life well lived. And in honoring her, he had honored himself. In seeing Mia, he had discovered the profound truth that human dignity is the most valuable currency of all. In the end, the mansion was no longer a cage. It was a place of possibility. The walls had not changed, the floors had not moved, the chandeliers still sparkled. But the energy inside was different, alive with recognition, respect, and moral courage. And in that space, Adrian and Mia both learned what the world often forgets. True power is measured not by what you control, not by what you possess, but by whose humanity you choose to honor. And as the sunlight dimmed into the soft glow of evening, Mia's laughter echoed down the halls. Adrian's gaze followed her, and he understood fully, finally, that the act of recognition, the courage to honor, and the quiet bravery of vulnerability had the power to transform lives, not just hers, but his, and the world he had built.